who's made a mistake. These are all fundamental, privacy-based rights which the Supreme Court correctly recognized. They should all remain the law of the land. Today, I want to talk about the right to contraception that this extremist and out-of-touch Supreme Court and legislators in red states are taking aim at. The Supreme Court has recognized the constitutional right to contraception for more than half a century, since its decision in the Griswold case in 1965. And over time, the court has affirmed and expanded that right. In its 1972 decision, a Massachusetts case, Eisenstadt versus Baird, recognizing the right of all people to access contraceptives regardless of marital status, and in its 1977 decision, in Carey versus Population Services International, which held that a state could not constitutionally prohibit the distribution of contraceptives to minors. The right to contraception is therefore a fundamental right that the court has repeatedly recognized and reaffirmed. It is a right that is central to a person's health, to their well-being, to their life, liberty, equality, and economic and social freedom in our country. It is a right grounded in the need and ability to make decisions about one's own body, one's own family, and one's own future. It is a right that is woven into the fabric of a free, pluralistic, and modern society. And it is a right that we must codify and make part of our law so that far-right extremist judges and elected officials cannot take it away in order to advance their own blatantly political agendas. That is why I have proudly introduced the Right to Contraception Act with my colleagues, Senators Mazie Hirono and Tammy Duckworth, and with Senator Blumenthal and Chair Patty Murray of the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, and joined by more than half of the Democratic Senate caucus. The Right to Contraception Act would codify the Supreme Court's decision in Griswold recognizing the right to obtain and use contraception. The Right to Contraception Act would enshrine that right in federal law, and it would guarantee a health care provider's right to prescribe contraceptive products and services and information related to them. The bill would also protect a range of contraceptives that are legally marketed under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And the Right to Contraception Act would authorize the U.S. Attorney General, as well as individuals and healthcare providers harmed by unlawful restrictions, to go to court to enforce the rights the bill establishes. In short, the Right to Contraception Act would safeguard the rights established by more than 50 years of Supreme Court precedent and would protect access to contraception even if Griswold were overturned. The concerns that have led to the introduction of this bill are not merely hypothetical. Justice Thomas's concurring opinion was a call to action that some Republicans and red states are eagerly heeding by continuing to attack and to restrict the right to contraception. Several states have already gone after access to contraception by cutting off public funding for it, by seeking to define abortion broadly enough to include contraception, and by allowing healthcare providers to refuse to provide services related to contraception based on their own personal beliefs. And the harms that would flow from abolishing the right to contraception aren't merely theoretical. Attacks on healthcare, especially reproductive healthcare, falls hardest on historically marginalized communities, including Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, people with low incomes, those living in rural and underserved areas, and immigrants. Last week, we all, on our side, proudly watched the House pass its version of the Right to Contraception Act by a vote of 220 to 195. And though it is dismaying, only 8 House Republicans, only 8, voted to codify that right. With the right to abortion stolen and the right to contraception threatened and the need to protect and expand access to contraceptive methods and information on contraception, it makes it more imperative than ever that we pass this legislation. We can't wait for the next hammer to drop. We have an urgent obligation to take the first exit off this slippery slope that leads to the loss of our most important personal freedoms, chief amongst them, the right of every American to make their own decisions about their bodies, their family, and their own futures. We can't sit idly by and watch as decades of precedent, privacy rights, and progress are violated. We can't wait for the worst to come because it's already at our doorstep. To my anti-choice Republican colleagues, if you would deprive Americans of the choice to end a pregnancy, how can you also deprive them of the ability to prevent a pregnancy in the first place? Unless your ultimate aim is really to exert control over the bodies of others, especially the bodies of women. Then I expect to hear no objection to the unanimous consent request to pass the Right to Contraception Act. Otherwise, the Republican position will be clear to everyone. No abortion, but no birth control to prevent the need for one. That is where the Republican Party is today. I urge my Republican colleagues not to object to our unanimous consent request. And, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of S. 4612 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the bill be considered, read a third time, and passed, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Madam President, reserving the right to object.
The junior senator from Iowa.
Reserving the right to object, Madam President. Here we are again. Another day, another sympathetically titled bill offered by my Democrat colleagues where the talking points don't really give you the full story. Case in point, the Right to Contraception Act. The so-called Right to Contraception Act purposefully goes far beyond the scope of contraception. It includes provisions that could guarantee the funding of abortion providers and defines contraceptive in such a broad way that it could include drugs to induce an abortion weeks or months into a pregnancy. This definition also could include non-FDA approved drugs that would actually put a woman's health at risk. The bill also flies in the face of decades of work providing for conscious protections. It would require organizations to administer contraceptives despite their moral or religious beliefs. Madam President, there is something insidious with this bill, but don't take it from me. Look to the bill's text itself. The findings section of this bill notes the work of an organization that many of my colleagues will recognize, the United Nations Populations Fund. This is the same organization that contributed over $10 million to a mass sterilization campaign in Peru in the 90s. That campaign was rife with coercive practices. Quotas were set, cash bonuses were paid to health workers for each client sterilized, and poor women were bribed with nutritional supplements and clothes for their children. And let's not forget the former Population Fund executive director's high praise of China's one-child policy. But let's be clear here. Routine use contraceptives should be more easily available. And the fact that they aren't has the biggest impact on women in rural areas, where a doctor could be dozens of miles away. A woman in a rural area doesn't need a platitude-filled messaging bill like the one we have here. They need over-the-counter access to routine use birth control. Luckily, Republicans have a solution. My bill, the Allowing Greater Access to Safe and Effective Contraception Act, incentivizes manufacturers of contraceptives to file an application for over-the-counter access. It also allows priority review for these applications and waives the FDA filing fee. That means cheaper, quicker, and more available access for women across this nation. With my bill, women 18 and over can walk into their local pharmacy, whether that be in Sydney, Iowa, or the deepest parts of Manhattan, and get the routine use birth control they need. Madam President, when your doctor is 30 miles away and gas is $6 a gallon, you don't need a messaging bill, you need access. And therefore, I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S4638, which is at the desk. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The junior senator from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Madam President. I do reserve the right to object, and I thank the senator from Iowa, but her bill would not ensure access to birth control, and it fails to codify the constitutional right to birth control across the United States. In fact, her bill would actually restrict access to birth control for individuals under the age of 18, requiring a prescription, even if the Food and Drug Administration has approved an over-the-counter option. And we cannot lose sight of the fact that this bill does nothing to address the reality that for many women, true access means being able to afford birth control as well. Last month, I co-sponsored a bill that would guarantee that insurers fully cover over-the-counter birth control without any out-of-pocket costs. No one should have to jump through ridiculous hoops or pay extra just to get the birth control which they need. Not to mention that this bill would do nothing to prevent states from restricting or even banning access to birth control. The reality is that Republicans refuse to acknowledge, and that is that over-the-counter option doesn't help patients if their states are chipping away at their right to birth control. So, with the senator from Iowa's objection to my unanimous consent request, and with her counter-unanimous consent request, Republicans have made their position crystal clear. No abortion, but no birth control to prevent the need for one. Republicans have just showed the American people where they stand on their right to contraception, while Republicans won't protect our fundamental rights as the Supreme Court and right-wing state legislatures take them away. My Democratic colleagues and I will continue to make our efforts to keep in place the fundamental privacy-based rights that Americans have had for decades and codify into federal law the right to contraception. As a result, for those reasons, I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President.
The senior senator from Washington.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, it has been nearly 60 years since the Supreme Court decided Griswold versus Connecticut and affirmed Americans' right to privacy and with it, their right to contraception. So you'd think this would be a settled issue. And for the vast majority of Americans, it is. The right to birth control is overwhelmingly popular. It turns out people want to be able to control their own bodies and make their own decisions about starting a family. Yet, as we just saw, somehow in the year 2022, this is not a settled issue for Republican politicians. We have seen some of my Republican colleagues not only block this, but try to deny reality, try to say this isn't an issue, or claim that Democrats are somehow wasting time. Well, that's pretty rich, because I can't help but remember how we all heard some Republicans saying the Supreme Court would not overturn Roe as well. How they tried to claim Democrats were overreacting, even as they stacked our courts with anti-abortion judges and worked for decades to chip away at abortion rights. And now we are seeing the nightmare we warned about become reality. Women unable to control their own bodies and get the abortion care they need. A nightmare Republicans tried to deny and are still trying to deny, even as it happens, even as 10-year-olds are having to travel across state lines for an abortion after being raped, even as women are now being left bleeding for days, waiting for treatment for their miscarriage. So when Republicans say they support the right to birth control, my issue isn't simply that I'm skeptical, it's that I know better. And let's be clear, when I say I know better, I don't just mean in my gut. I mean I have heard Republicans' own words. I am watching their own actions. Justice Thomas said explicitly in his concurring opinion in Dobbs that he wants the court to reconsider Griswold, which affirmed the right to contraception. The senior senator from Tennessee said the Griswold decision was unsound. That alone would be scary enough, but Republicans aren't just talking about undermining access to birth control, they are already taking action. Read the legislation from Republicans in Idaho, Missouri, Louisiana, Arkansas, Michigan, which would in fact outlaw Plan B and IUDs. Talk to women who've already gone to the pharmacy only to be denied their birth control or Plan B. Yes, this is already happening to people. And just last week, 195 House Republicans voted against the right to Contraception Act. And now, today, they've blocked it in the Senate as well. The evidence of where Republicans actually stand on birth control is overwhelming. They aren't standing for women. They aren't standing for families. They aren't standing for a right nearly all Americans support. They are simply standing in the way. I want to thank the junior senator from Massachusetts, the junior senator from Illinois, and the junior senator from Hawaii for their work with me on the Right to Contraception Act that Republicans just blocked. I know we're going to all keep working on this, and I do want to set the record straight because so many of the arguments we have seen from Republicans don't add up. They're trying to distract from their extreme position. We won't let them. Madam President, this bill is incredibly straightforward. So you simply cannot say you support the right to birth control and then block this bill. I hope everyone will listen closely because here is what this bill actually does. It simply codifies Americans' right to birth control into law. That's it. And you don't have to take my word for it. Read it yourself. It's all of 15 pages. It protects a right people depend on and makes sure no one can take that away. And we're talking about a really basic and really fundamental right here. Since that right was affirmed half a century ago, generations of Americans have used contraception to control their own future, to manage and treat their healthcare needs, and start a family when they are ready to. For them, it is not political, and it shouldn't be political here in Congress either, especially when protecting this right is supported by a majority of Democrats, a majority of independents, and yes, even a clear majority of Republicans. Madam President, the American people are watching closely. They were watching previously when Senate Republicans blocked us from protecting the right to travel across states to get abortion care. They were watching last week when Senate Republicans blocked expanding support for our nation's long-standing family planning program. They were watching when the vast majority of Republicans in the House voted against the right to birth control. And they're watching right now as Republicans block a bill that preserves the right to use condoms, take the pill, get IUDs, and buy Plan B. As Republicans refuse to let us protect that right and pass this bill and continue denying the threats that are already undermining that right. This is a basic, fundamental right. And mark my words, the American people will not forget Republicans from blocking us getting this done. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
The junior senator from Colorado.
Madam President, in 1963, Americans could be arrested in some states simply for buying birth control pills. 60 years later, if many states have their way, Americans may face that reality once again. The Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade is so sweeping, so unprecedented, that it now threatens the right to contraception. IUDs, emergency contraceptives, and other birth control could well all be banned, which seems hard to imagine. We're going backwards in time to when women did not have control of their own bodies, nor the freedom to decide how and when they wanted to begin their families. Who really believes a woman shouldn't be able to use birth control? That a woman shouldn't be able to decide whether or not she wants to get pregnant? That a couple can't decide they aren't ready for a family? How many children should each woman have? Should it be as many as possible? Are they allowed to stop reproducing? Or is it a lifelong duty? Politicians should not be making these decisions. This is a bill that guarantees a woman's right to access legal contraception. That's it. There's no trick, no sleight of hand. We can pass it into law today. The House has passed it already. Starting a family is among the most private and personal decisions a person can make. It changes your life in ways that most of us can't even imagine. And yet there are people who want to force this restriction on women. For women everywhere, but especially in rural and low-income areas, birth control is essential health care. If you want to prevent unintended pregnancies, well, that's where you start. When I was governor, Colorado made long-acting reversible contraception, like IUDs, available at little or no cost. That reduced unintended pregnancies by 54%. 54%. Yet now in Colorado, some Republicans are campaigning to put an initiative on the ballot this November that could make contraception and contraceptives illegal. Many other states are considering similar moves with bills and amendments waiting in the wings. I think this is far, far beyond the mainstream of what most Americans believe. In fact, 92% of Americans in a recent Gallup poll said that contraception is morally acceptable. My mother was born in 1921, a child of the Great Depression. She scrimped and saved every penny, but she always made it a point to make some donation to Planned Parenthood. Some years it might only be $10, but she believed there were few burdens harder for a woman to bear than being compelled to start a family before she was ready. As a mother of four, she knew how important it was for women to be able to make that decision for themselves. Who are we as politicians to tell American women who has children, how many, and when? Madam Chair, I yield the floor. Madam President, I yield the floor.
The senior senator from Minnesota.
Madam President, I rise in support of the Right to Contraception Act. 33 days ago, the Supreme Court issued a rule shredding nearly 5 decades of precedent, protecting a woman's right to make her own health care decisions. Now women, as we have seen over the last weeks, are at the mercy are at the mercy of a patchwork of state laws governing their ability to access reproductive care, leaving them with fewer rights than their moms and their grandmas. So now a woman in Minnesota has different rights when it comes to her reproductive care than a woman in Missouri. A woman in North Dakota has different rights than a woman in Indiana. That's what we're dealing with right now. 2 weeks ago, I joined several of my Democratic colleagues on the floor to push for legislation to preserve a woman's right to travel to other states to access reproductive care, led by Senator Cortez Masto. Unfortunately, Republicans on the other side of the aisle blocked us from that vote. So we came back last week to push for legislation led by my colleague, Senator Tina Smith, to protect and expand funding for a program created under a Republican administration, a Republican presidential administration, to fund clinics that support maternal care, conduct cancer screenings, and provide contraception. But again, that vote failed because we were not allowed to move forward with it. So we came back to the floor today because if the Supreme Court won't protect people's fundamental rights, that's why we have 3 branches of government. That was the concept of our founding fathers. So if the Supreme Court isn't going to protect people's fundamental rights, then everyone in this chamber has to decide whether or not they're going to do it. And that includes making sure everyone can access contraception. I'm concerned that the worst is yet to come. Right now, state and local legislators are literally racing, along with governors, to be the first to say which state can limit rights the most first. What rights can we take away? Sadly, it's not too hard to guess. In his concurring opinion in Dobbs, Justice Thomas actually laid out a roadmap with clear directions for how the court could overturn the right to contraception. He said that the Supreme Court, and this is a quote, should reconsider. Should reconsider. Those 2 words, they should reconsider. Whether the Constitution protects the right to access contraception as well as the right to marry whoever you love. Why? Because he talked about looking at other cases with regard to right to privacy. The Supreme Court has recognized the right to access contraception for more than 57 years, but the conservative justices on the Supreme Court have shown they don't hesitate to overturn decades-old precedent, no matter what they say at their Supreme Court hearings. This threat is not hypothetical. Last year, the Missouri state legislature tried to cut off public funding for widely used contraceptives like IUDs and Plan B. Mississippi's governor has refused to rule out banning contraception, and a bill was introduced in Louisiana this spring that could be used to make IUDs illegal. These radical proposals don't just hurt those in the states that implement the bans. Since the Dobbs decision, we have now seen how state bans create an uncertain legal environment for doctors and strain resources at clinics in states like Minnesota, because the North Dakota clinic had to literally start a GoFundMe page to be able to get the costs paid for, the cost, of course, of moving the clinic from Fargo, North Dakota to Moorhead. That's what's happening right now in my state. We cannot settle for a situation, as I noted, where people in my state have different rights than women in Mississippi or Missouri. And with so many extreme politicians out there racing to state capitals to be the first to take people's rights away, we need to explicitly protect the right to access contraception and information about contraception. I will note that more than 80% of Americans support access to contraception. That's why I join with Senators Markey, Hirono, Murray, and Duckworth in co-sponsoring this bill to protect the right to access contraception and information about contraceptives. This bill safeguards a patient's ability to seek contraceptives and a healthcare provider's ability to provide those critical services. The right to contraception can't just be an empty promise. That's why the bill gives the Department of Justice, as well as patients and doctors, the power to make sure that we don't infringe on the right to contraception. I'm proud to join my colleagues, and for the last 33 days, I've been thinking about all the women in this country facing an unacceptably uncertain future. Today, each and every one of my colleagues had the opportunity to make clear where they stand. But when given the opportunity, some seized the opportunity to protect the right to contraception, some did not. I hope that some of our colleagues will change their minds and we can move forward with this and put in place these laws protecting the right to travel, protecting the right to contraception, and of course, in the end, protecting a woman's fundamental right to make her own reproductive decisions about abortion. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent. Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the following senators be permitted to speak prior to the scheduled roll call vote. Myself for up to 15 minutes, Senator Blackburn for up to 10 minutes, Senator Tester for up to 5 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, coming to the floor and listening to some of my colleagues talk about their concern for lack of access to contraception, and some have